Thank you for tuning into the Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. Once upon a time, a comic strip was a poor and baptized and unrecognized stepsister of caricature, which was the poor sister of the graphic arts, which were the poor sisters of fine arts. If there was a fairy godmother at the birth of the Sleeping Beauty, the prince of the public acclaim was slow in coming to wake her. Such is the witty humor that sets in motion David Kunzle's new monograph called Rebirth of the English comic strip, a Kaleidoscope from 1847 to 1870. Today, I have the honor again to speak with Dr. Kunzle, Professor Emeritus of Art History at UCLA, about his new book. Hello, David. It's a great pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
Your new book offers a comprehensive and intensive survey of the British comic strip in the period of the mid-Victorian generation, namely from 1847 to 1870. So could you please share more insights on this periodization?
Well, it can appear a little odd, a little surprising, and perhaps needs defending and explaining. That what happened in 1847 or 1870 to give me the beginning and ending dates of my study, which I decided on quite a long time ago. The beginning point was not hard because it is the first eruption into the English journalistic scene of the comic strip after a long period of abeyance. I should explain that first of all. Those of you who have been following a bit the history of caricature will know that caricature as such became commonplace and popularized the single sheets and small albums that George Cruikshank was an expert at doing at the beginning of the century, during the great age of caricatures, as opposed to, shall we say, Hogarthian satire. Gilray and Rowlandson and many other caricaturists devoted much of their life to caricature and to making fun of the politicians of the day and the scandals of the day in the late 18th century. Continued into about 1820, then stopped. Caricature became a sort of portrait caricature, which was not so interesting. It was not really telling stories about them, and it was not inventive. And there was a big gap between 1820s and 1842 when Cruikshank attempted a sort of Hogarthian narrative, which was not successful. But in January 1847, a new magazine started called Man in the Moon, which was intended as a kind of an imitation or rival to Punch. It wasn't really a rival because it's totally different in character and in its format, which was so small it would fit into your pocket like a railway guide. The traveller expected to pick it up on his way to anywhere, slip it into his pocket. Railway travel was still exciting. It was still new in 1847 and would become massively popular with the building of new railway lines. And the comic strip is really born on those railway lines in the succeeding years, especially with Punch, which took over fairly soon by the 1850s. Finally, on this, I will end on this, my 1870 Liberty, where I stopped my book. Alice Sloper has made it into the Franco-Prussian War. And I will end briefly on this because it is an extraordinary comment on this horrible war, which the English watched in some dismay and with much interest, because this is a death struggle going on between France and Germany, two nearest neighbors. The British taking sides. To begin with, sympathizing a little bit with Prussia, into which our royal family was married. But later, when the French began to be defeated and obviously losing large number of people and morale and reputation, because the French are supposed to have the best army in Europe, now overtaken by the Prussians, in a way which is then followed in a comic fashion. And just quite what comedy means at this point is a good question, because this is the most uncomic of events. It's a full-blown war, which lasts almost a year between the two countries. before the French finally gave up. By the middle of 1871, they had admitted defeat, and they were dealing with that defeat for many years afterwards, although recovering from it and able to build the Eiffel Tower, for instance, which is a miraculous achievement for a country which is suffering from this massive defeat by the Prussians. The defeat of their army, but also of their reputation and their claim to be the cultural leaders of Europe, which they maintained at this time into the 80s. And I don't know how far the Eiffel Tower would show up in the comic strip. I'd like to think it does, but I never got much past 1870, because that is when the comic strip reaches a climax in an extraordinary episode. I mean, extraordinary in a way, psychologically very, very curious.
Well, this book certainly enriched us with the British context, first touched upon more than a generation ago in your significant monograph, The Early Comic Strip, and then in the History of the Comic Strip, Volume 2, the 19th century. This time, however, you zoomed in on the English comic strip, and could you please enlighten us on what the word rebirth entails?
Well, it's a rebirth in the sense that it had been dormant, apart from a rather unfortunate exercise by semi-imitation, a sort of inspiration that Cruikshank had, that he could do something as funny as Töpfer, and he couldn't. I knew it. And his response, I didn't mention the response of Cruikshank to the ascendance of Töpfer, to the Töpferian, a sense that Töpfer is saying something philosophically as well as humoristically important about life. Töpfer is, in his way, a philosopher of life. And so there's a gap. So I say between Cruikshank and the bursting on the scene of a firework display of Man in the Moon, there is nothing until January 47. At which point, Sham, coincidentally, finds himself, or because he is already in England, gets drafted into joining the staff of Man in the Moon, which he immediately quits. He does one drawing and goes back home. He has work to do at home. So Sham, who is the star of another volume, even bigger than the one I've just described, of the Rebirth, Sham is the rebirth of the comic strip in France, of the rebirth of the comic strip at that level of interest and comedic shenanigans, which the English never managed, except perhaps McConnell, I mentioned, skated over too fast. The Adventures of Mr. Wilderspin, not in Punch, but another magazine, which attempts a kind of extension which earns it the title of the third comic novel in England of this period. So it's a rare occurrence that anyone has dared to do a whole graphic novel, the commercial fate of which was completely up in the air. Nobody knew. I'm sure McConnell didn't know as he set out, are people going to want to hang on to my story for 23 pages? And he probably would have continued if the magazine had continued. But as so often happened in these other magazines than Punch, Punch was immortal. Punch was never in danger of expiring until the 20th century, until the second half of the 20th century. I remember it as a child very much, sort of dentist waiting room fodder. Only Punch could survive. But these other magazines attempted to give themselves life support, so to speak, a life support with ingestion of comic strips, the fate of which you never know. You never know quite how popular they were, except to know that they didn't last. They didn't last because the magazine couldn't last. If they'd been told by the proprietor, hey, good reaction to these 3 pages of adventures of whatever, whoever, keep it going, he might have. McConnell might have, who had real talents for this, might have continued, but he isn't able to because the magazine disappears. And he never gets invited on the Punch staff. Punch has its own agendas. And so what happens is that Punch makes do with really bits of Daumier being as Darwinian as he can, and semi-narrative, I mean, semi in the sense of a narrative which involves one object turning into another object, or a person, in one case, is fighting a sort of Darwinian duel, which he loses, and which is an allegory of the American Civil War.
Could you help us understand how English comic strips had a quite different historical and literary context compared with their continental counterparts, mainly exemplified by Tepfer and Sham or Ham?
Yes, it is different. It's never as continuous. There's nothing like Tepfer.
Mm-hmm.
It shows up in France. It shows up in a minor way in Germany. The French strips are very hardy. And first of all, French magazines lasted. There was a real taste for comic magazines in France. And they elicited continuous comic strips, which were, however, short. One page, maybe 2 pages. And they never created a character until you get to the end of the century who might compete in hardiness, shall we say, or in popularity with anything that the English seem to be attempting, but actual fact don't really attempt, because the English comic strip goes into a strange sort of a degeneration. In the 80s, with the price being dropped at the end of this, during the 80s, to a halfpenny, which was really dirt cheap. And I don't think you couldn't afford to pay anybody anything for that price. And so what happened was that the magazines stole guiltlessly from America and particularly Germany, Wilhelm Busch, very occasionally the French, but more from the United States by the 90s. The United States producing its own comic strips by this time. But they were being plagiarized, as Wilhelm Busch was. And the end of the story really is with Wilhelm Busch. Wilhelm Busch is the universal treasure house of comic strip ideas, which he inundated Germany with. I say inundated, we don't think that there was, a new album from Wilhelm Busch every year, not quite that, but certainly every other year. And his oeuvre encompasses, 50 books, some of which are really funny, and some of which are considered a little unpleasant, because he gets one point, never mind, deals with subjects which one thinks of today as inadmissible. And he dies a famous German, and functioning, it seems like, the way he is quoted in after-dinner speeches, functioning a little bit like Shakespeare or the Bible in Britain. You have to elevate the character of the intellectual level, the artistic level of your verse, remembering that all the comic strips, which I haven't talked about, the literary elements in that, but they all have captions, more or less uninteresting, but anyway, not important enough to talk about here, the captions. But Wilhelm Busch, the captions are brilliant verse. And he was recognized as a poet. I like to think as a really good poet. The Germans tell me, no, we don't consider him really good. He's just a comic poet. What do you mean, just a comic poet? It's hard to write good comic poetry, isn't it? Well, no, not like, other Germans have done better, put it that way. But here, conjoined to brilliant drawings that Wilhelm Busch, of course, attached to the commentary, or the other way around. And the way in which he was plagiarized by massively in this last third of the 19th century is a chapter in itself. I touch on it, I think, a little bit. And I will certainly mention it as a major factor in the sheer survival and cheapness. Because you've got all these things from Wilhelm Busch. You're not paying a thing for them. They're all for free, right? Mm-hmm. So it's cheap material for a paper which now had sunk to the level of a halfpenny paper, mm-hmm. and the worst quality paper, and in some ways a rather poor quality humor. But I wouldn't like to judge that, because eventually by the end of the 19th century, you get a characters like Weary Willie and Tired Tim. And Weary Willie and Tired Tim are two tramps, a little bit not similar to Alice Sloper, but still down and outs, with a new level of humor that only down and outs. And, I could quote kind of jokes. I'll give you one of their jokes. You'll love it. Christmas will love this. First tramp to second tramp. This could be Weary Willie and Tired Tim. If we had eggs, we could have bacon and eggs, answers the second tramp, if we had bacon. That's funny. Well, the drawings are quite good, and they generate a form of, I haven't used the word slapstick, which begins to appear in the late 70s, at the end of the period I'm dealing with. But slapstick, as you can imagine, becomes a very important feature of the new comic strip, partly because, much because, film takes it over.
Right. So what were other historical and literary conditions that largely influenced and defined the aestheticism of the English comic strips? For example, especially the novel.
That's a good point. A few of the comic strip artists, notably Watts Phillips, wrote a number of novels. Du Maurier wrote some novels that are quite readable. Mm-hmm. He created the character of Trilby and of he's become part of folklore, almost an evil-minded a sort of magician who magics. Svengali, created by Du Maurier. So some of these artists, some of these writers and artists will manage both sides of the comic strip production, which is always a story, isn't it? Because sometimes you can't. Nowadays, my impression is that the comic strips are often done by two separate people, a scenarist and an artist. Isn't that right? And this began to happen a little bit right with Man in the Moon, two separate artists. But most of the period I've been talking about, this 20 years, the artist is the same as the writer. But the evidence for their doing the writing themselves is a little contentious, because in some cases they just took over funny stories, mm-hmm. jokes ready-made, which they would insert into their comic strips. You can say that the captions are either not brilliant. First of all, they're not in verse. Wilhelm Busch is all in verse. None of the English ones are, which is obviously hard to manage, hard to make interesting, to succeed in the way Wilhelm Busch makes the verse as comic as the drawing. It's hard to imagine, because how do you do that? Right. So he is a model for future comic strips. And it'd be an interesting exercise, another book, to show how Wilhelm Busch influenced, indirectly perhaps, the English picture story into verse. I think Rupert Bear was a very comic strip, started in the 20s, I think, mm-hmm. which is, the captions are in verse. And that was hard to do. And don't think that magazines expected it or wanted it or encouraged it. I don't know that. but it certainly became a feature of the child's comic book, particularly because it is assumed, correctly, I think, that children enjoy reading comic verse as much as they do looking at children's comic drawing.
Mm-hmm. Well, how do you view the role Punch played in the English comic strip of this period, and how Punch enhanced the status of comic strips?
Very much. But there is a problem because Punch was always iffy. Mm-hmm. The attitude of Punch, if you actually trace from my book the incidence of comic strips, you'll find it's irregular in the period I'm dealing with. And later, it disappears altogether. Du Maurier does he seems to have had nightmares. I think they were real. He had nightmares and he put those into his pen. But a couple of times and unimportant. He never adopted the comic strip again. He wrote novels instead in the later part of the century. And they are decent novels. Some of them sort of, in their odd way, hymns to the beauty of tallness, the idea of the beautiful woman being a tall woman, like his wife and his mother were apparently. And the idea that the best comic strips where the artist and the writer are one person. I don't know how far that is a rule. I'm sure it isn't universal, but it happens quite a lot. And I think some of the most highly valued in comic strips, there is a dual authorship. There is one mind, one imagination driving the story and driving the drawing at the same time. It's almost a sort of magical territory when the writing comes into it. But how far it really has, I suppose, and it's a question you could ask. The person to ask would be John Lent, who runs iJoker, that is the International Journal of Comic Art, which is just reviewed, by the way. I could put in a plug for the reviews that have appeared of my book in that magazine. But otherwise, if you checked into this huge, very considerable magazine, which is 20, 30 articles in it, each issue, which is twice a year, and find out whether they are by the artists or by others. One thing I can guarantee is there is nothing like Wilhelm Busch appeared on the English scene. And it's an oddity which I find, I hope I can be if you get a flood of letters saying, there is an English Wilhelm Busch you missed, Kunzle. And I'd say, well, all right, where? Tell me more. But the fact is that I know of no artist-poet combo which has reached the level of Wilhelm Busch. I mean, the recognized artistic and reputational level, because, Busch's reputation, Wilhelm Busch's reputation does depend on his mastery of the both arts, which he cherished. I mean, he really honed his rhymes as much as he honed the wonderful elasticity of the line that he developed, because there's nobody who could draw like an elastic rubber band like Wilhelm Busch. You have to honor him for that. You have to wonder why, if it is true, throw this out into the ether, into the world, that he has not been imitated in his mastery of both art forms. The only attempt to put him into English, I have read, is not good. I don't agree at all, because I have seen a version by the English language, I should say, an American professor called Walter Arndt, who must be of German origin and must know the German language very, very well indeed, of putting Busch into English, which is very, very difficult because of the multiple. I mean, Busch's genius linguistically depends much on his ability to make the verse funny. Any master of comic verse I'm sure Ogden Nash does this. There are lots of good writers of comic verse around. I don't think they are magicians, linguistic magicians like Wilhelm Busch was, because he started out in prose captions, and then shifted to verse as he discovered was easy for him.
So that was a great conversation, and it's always such a great pleasure to talk to you, David. Thank you again for coming to the show.
Well, I'm so glad to give you a chance to talk about this material, which is obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have done a whole book on the subject, has been undervalued, put it that way.
Right.
The whole era has been undervalued. And to bring this into the open and to show it has a value, even if the drawings are not, maybe not that brilliant. I think some of them are, even if the captions are not brilliant. And I know that few of them are. The descriptions, the literary component is deficient compared with what maybe even Charles in France was doing, and certainly what Wilhelm Busch was doing in Germany. Thank you for inviting me.